Hi, I'm Chad Kripe, the editor of the Idaho Statesman, and welcome to our reporter discussion of the Moscow student homicides and ensuing Bryan Kohberger case. We conceived of this panel as a preview of the highly anticipated trial, but obviously a plea deal led us to change our plans. So today, I've invited four of our reporters to provide our readers some insight into how we covered one of the biggest news stories in Idaho history and the case that came out of it. Joining me today are Sally Krutzig, who is a breaking news reporter for us and was on duty on the Sunday that the murders happened. She also contributed to our coverage throughout the past 2.5 years, including producing many of our TikToks on the case. Angela Palermo, business and public health reporter and University of Idaho graduate, who was our first staff member to travel to Moscow in search of answers. Kevin Fixler, investigative reporter, became our lead reporter on the case as we tried to learn more about what happened and who did it and why. And Alex Brizzi, our criminal justice reporter and another U of I graduate, who took on a large role in particular as the court case played out in Boise. We've gotten a ton of questions. We're going to try to get to as many of them as we can. We probably can't get to all. Well, I know we can't get to all of them. I'll try to grab some of the comments as we go, but just know that we've got a lot. So there's only so much ground we can cover here. But I do appreciate the questions, appreciate a lot of the kind words that were shared as well as you guys submitted questions. Figure it's easiest to start at the beginning. So I remember hearing that 4 college students had died in one house on November 13th, 2022, and almost immediately telling my boss that I needed money to send a reporter to Moscow to try to figure out what was going on because there was so little information at the time. That day, I think it's easy to forget. We didn't even know if a crime had occurred with the amount of information that was provided. So, like I said, Sally was on duty that day. Sally, what do you remember from that first day and trying to figure out what was happening?
Yeah, so as the Sunday reporter, I am the only person on our staff who works on Sundays. And I think the first inkling was when Alex, actually, who, as Chad said, graduated from the University of Idaho, reached out to me and started being like, hey, I'm hearing things from people back in Moscow. 4 people died in a house. And those rumors were kind of the first indication something was happening. And what really strikes me is how I absolutely did not guess this was a quadruple murder. I thought this had to be some sort of accident. But I started making calls immediately. I think I was the first person, maybe the second, to talk to Moscow police. And they did confirm to me that this was a homicide. And when I put that information out there, when I reported this, that is really when everything changed.
Yeah, when this stuff happens, it becomes a sensation on social media. Part of our job, obviously, is trying to sort through the rumors and the tips and find out what's real. And like you said at the beginning, it was like we didn't even know that this was a homicide. And so I remember there was speculation like, could it have been drugs? Could it have been a gas in the house? Something like that. And so what did you learn about covering a notorious crime like this in the early days? And how did you and the rest of our staff make sure we were providing responsible coverage?
For me, the biggest takeaway was definitely to verify. Right after it happened, there were so many rumors. Maybe this happened, maybe this person did it, whatever. And it can be so tempting to be like, I keep hearing everyone saying this, so there must be some truth to it. But this was a lesson in how wrong that was. So many of the rumors turned out to be completely inaccurate. But I'm really proud of the way the Idaho Statesman and our team never, gave into those rumors. We were always going to people with firsthand knowledge of this case. We're going to police, we're going to the university, the prosecutor's office, the families, to get people who would know and be able to debunk those rumors.
Within 24 hours or so, we decided to send Angela to Moscow. Not only does she know the community, but fortunately she had a place she could stay for however long we needed. So she ended up staying for many weeks. We were talking the other day, we can't remember now, 2 months or 10 weeks or something, sharing the community's perspective on the crime and chasing tips. Angela, what was it like for you returning to Moscow under those circumstances?
Yeah, it was challenging for a number of reasons. There was just so much uncertainty and confusion in those early days. And I, of course, had just joined the newsroom at the Statesman a few months prior to cover business and public health. And so I didn't have a lot of experience covering crime, but I did have a lot of experience covering Moscow and the University of Idaho, first for the student newspaper, and after I graduated for the Moscow Pullman Daily News. And yeah, my boyfriend at the time, now my fiance, was up there finishing grad school, and so I drove up and stayed with him in our old apartment, the top floor of an old house near the university. And he was pretty shaken up because the university had sent out this vandal alert that said to shelter in place, which the university rarely sent out vandal alerts saying to shelter in place. So that was something in and of itself. And I later spoke to a student who was working a shift at the campus library, and who had to like lock it down, and keep all of the students inside, until that order was lifted. And when it was, all the university said was to remain vigilant. And so there wasn't much information beyond that. Yeah, there were just a lot of questions at first about what had happened, what was going on, and not a lot of answers.
One of the early signs of how intense the scrutiny of this case would be was that first press conference in Moscow, which I think police admitted later was later than it should have been. Angela, I know you had trouble even getting access to the event. There were so many people there. What happened, and what was that scene like?
Yeah, that was new for me to cover something where there was so much media scrutiny. It quickly devolved into this thing where there was a lot of national media attention, after the first few days, and a lot of pressure on the mayor, the police chief, and the university officials. And so there was this press conference that had been scheduled, and all of a sudden, there were reporters from all over the country trying to attend, some of the biggest names in television news like CNN, Fox, and CBS. And they were all trying to get into this news conference that had just been scheduled in this tiny room in the police department's new building that had just finished being constructed. And so I showed up 15 minutes early thinking that would be enough time to get into this news conference. And it definitely wasn't. I got there and I was told they'd reached capacity, and I contacted my friend who worked in communications at the university, and he was able to get through to the right people to get me in. But I think that was like 5 or 10 minutes after it had started. And so there was a lot of attention, a lot of people there. And by the way, at that press conference, that was where it was a really big deal, because police were telling people that, this had happened, but not to worry, that, they were saying the rest of the community wasn't in danger. But they also admitted that they didn't know who had killed these 4 students. They had no idea who had done it. So at that point, the community was just kind of reeling. There was like shock, grief, and also people were quite scared.
You're also involved in one of our most significant scoops during the case. The police were asking stores about purchases of certain knives. What'd you learn, and how'd you get that information?
Yeah, at that point, police were saying that the students had been killed with an edged weapon, but they weren't saying much beyond that. And so we had heard that police were canvassing businesses in town, trying to get information, asking questions, looking for surveillance footage, that kind of thing. And we heard that they had gone to some of the local hardware stores, some of the ones that when I lived in Moscow, I would go get like plants and potting soil and things like that. So I went to some of those places, and the general manager of one of those stores, the Moscow Building Supply, told me that police had visited multiple times to ask whether the store had sold anyone K-bar knives or knives like that. In K-bar, it's those knives, it's like a military style weapon that's now mostly used by outdoorsmen. But the police had been there asking if they had sold anyone that. And so we reported that news. And of course, weeks later, we learned at the first hearing at the Latah County Courthouse after Bryan Kohberger was arrested that he had left a K-bar knife sheath on one of the victims' beds.
Kevin was involved in that early reporting, but his role really ramped up once Bryan Kohberger was arrested. Kevin spent time in Pullman, Washington, and Pennsylvania talking to people who knew Kohberger to give our readers a better understanding of the man who later admitted to the 4 murders. Kevin, what stood out to you about your time learning about his past in Pennsylvania and Pullman?
So after his arrest on December 30th, I ended up going up to Moscow and then going across the state line over to Pullman. And I spoke with some of the neighbors. By that time, a lot of the national media and regional media had already spoken with several of his apartment neighbors. That was a graduate school apartment complex at WSU. So many were not interested in continuing to speak. They had limited information. They could tell you that he was up at odd hours. They would hear noises and he would come in late and park in the same parking spot, that sort of thing. But one of his neighbors who had not been touched base with by a reporter yet was another graduate student. And I knocked on his door. He was not terribly interested in speaking, but he did crack the door, and I explained who I was and delicately broached the subject and asked if he had known his neighbor. And he did tell me that he had, and started to tell me that they had texted several times. They had walked the parking lot, and he had this unique experience with Kohberger walking around the area. And that was where I got what was sort of a scoop at the time, that Kohberger had divulged to him that he had done some of these ancestry websites and was interested about his own ancestry. And that ended up allowing us to write about what later came to be true. We had read and seen this several places, but that investigative genetic genealogy had been used on the DNA on the knife sheath, the single source of male DNA that police found. So we tried to understand if that's how police were able to connect to Bryan Kohberger. I wrote a big piece about that really questioned whether or not Bryan Kohberger led police right to him. That's not ultimately how it came out to be, but that was one of the great takeaways I had from my time in Pullman. And then immediately following that, I flew out to Pennsylvania and was in the Pocono Mountains. And I actually just sat with former Moscow Police Chief James Fry, and I was explaining to him sort of the trauma that these different communities had experienced. First, obviously, was that first wave in Moscow. That was what Angela was up there and experienced and witnessed with that community. I was sort of part of the second wave when I made my first trip up there. And then as Kohberger was arrested, I was in Pullman and sort of experienced that with that community. It was like the trauma and the shock had just moved over the state line. And so I experienced that with them. But when I went to Pennsylvania, it was still that first wave. And they were so stunned. They could not believe that this national case that everybody was talking about, the mystery of who it might be, how it had shown up to their doorstep, and that they had known this man and this family for all these years. So it was experiencing this trauma with that community just the same. And those communities are not that dissimilar. The Pocono Mountains are pretty rural and pretty similar to both Pullman and Moscow in some ways. And so it was almost like seeing this dark cloud come and arrive in this faraway community that couldn't understand that this had shown up and affected them too.
For 2.5 years after the arrest, Kevin competed with outlets across the country and sometimes internationally for news on this case. And we continue to try to sort through rumor and speculation to find the facts. Kevin, what was it like for you covering a story like this with so much attention and so many reporters around the country involved?
I think Sally spoke to it well, that we really had to vet our facts very closely and try to get all the information from officials and, check and check and check. We weren't going to report rumors and contribute to that. And there were many news outlets, national in scope, that were putting that type of information out. So in terms of trying to stay competitive as a smaller outlet, even though we're the largest newsroom in the state and Moscow is 6 hours north, 300 miles or so, it was really... if you couldn't be first in some regards, as we battled to try to get some of these officials in the early days before the gag order went into effect, it was really about being the best. And it was using our intuition and our institutional knowledge of this case after so many months and what became years, which is crazy to think about, almost 3 years now. But it was about using that knowledge to look through a different lens and the information and the court records to try to think about it in a different way. And look at things like search warrants to figure out the order in which police were filing for those and the leads they were chasing. We can now see with a lot of Moscow police record release the ways in which they were going about their investigation, but we didn't have that level of detail at that time. So it was looking at things like the search warrants and the return records that were redacted heavily, and trying to understand the way in which police went about their investigation, and just trying to think through questions in a different way. Things like I mentioned, the investigative genetic genealogy, once we were able to establish some of that information and try to make those connections and develop those ties to not only verify, but and confirm information, but then deliver new information for not only the Treasure Valley community here in the Boise area, but our state, and then of course the nation. And you also mentioned the international appetite for this story.
And then Alex became a big part of our coverage, particularly during the court case, using her expertise on the criminal justice system and her experience covering Daybell cases. Most notably, she was in line overnight before the sentencing to ensure we had a seat in the courtroom, and she was in the courtroom that day. Alex, what was that sentencing day like in the courtroom, and how did it compare to what you've seen in all the sentencings you've covered for us?
Yeah, so I mean, I've covered sentencings maybe on a weekly, if not every other week basis, and don't usually have to wait 8 hours in line to get into sentencing. Sentencings are pretty typical things we see in all court cases that end with a guilty plea or conviction. But it was a really emotional day. It was also a spectacle outside. There was people, national reporters, people line sitting for national reporters, true crime, just everybody who had this interest in this case waiting outside. I think Kevin actually got there at 11 p.m. and we swapped out at 1 a.m. so that I could simply get ready for the day, get on makeup and get ready as if I was going to work at midnight. And we swapped out, and I was there from 1 a.m. till I think we got out of the courthouse around maybe 1 or 2 p.m. and then went to the office to start writing. It was a really emotional day. Sentencings usually are, hearing from the victims and their families, and just watching all that emotion. It's incredibly tragic, and it's a really hard thing to witness, and it's something I do witness a lot. But I think, as someone who went to school at U of I, and just I think seeing all that, it was a really hard day, I think, for everyone, obviously. And we got to kind of I think really get to see the families kind of say their piece and give their final thoughts on what's been a years-long case.
Kevin and Alex, you two know this case extremely well. What was your reaction to the plea deal? We had been having meetings right before that, plotting our trial plan and getting everything ready to go, and then that dropped. What was your guys' reaction that day?
Yeah, I'll start. I think Kevin was actually on, vacation the day it happened. I was sitting in the office next to me and Kevin's editor, the editor we have, and I heard him call her on the phone, and I was like, oh no, what's going on? And I was actually working on another major national story that we had in the midst of writing it. And I just hear my editor, Hayat, go, okay, Alex, we'll have to handle that. And I was like, what could I possibly need to handle right now? And then she kind of whispers over to me, we think Kohberger might have taken a plea deal. And I was like, are you serious? Because as, Chad said, we were prepping to go to trial. All of us were planning to spend the next 3 months in court watching all this and reporting on it. So our immediate reaction was, okay, how can we confirm this? So, we just started cold calling everyone and anyone we could think of until I was able to get one of the family members to confirm to me, to send me a copy of the letter that was sent by the prosecution, kind of outlining the terms of the plea deal. I think it was unexpected, just because I think a case of this level, you expect to go to trial. I've reported on other higher profile cases we've had here, none as high profile as this, but the Daybell trials, those went to trial, other high profile things. But statistically, it's really common for cases to end in plea deals. It's actually, I think, like 97% end in a plea deal. So I think once I got past the initial shock of just like, well, we were just expecting this, and I kind of put back on my normal, like, okay, this is how the system works cap. This is the process, and this is about when it would happen. It's once they've kind of narrowed down everything and kind of figured things out, the defense is going to come and ask for that deal if they want to try to get the death penalty off the table, which is exactly what they did. So,
Kevin?
It was a wild day. There had been some rumors, I suppose would be the best I could say, that perhaps this could be coming, but that's not something I believed at all. Like Alex said, I fully expected that we were going to be going to trial in a matter of weeks, and expected that to last between 3 and 4 months, including sentencing, where Kohberger to be convicted. It was maybe a little bit of an omen, perhaps, or I guess maybe the irony. But when I got first called about this by you, Chad, or contacted about this case on November 13th, I happened to be in Denver traveling, seeing my family. I'm originally from Denver. And when the news of this plea agreement broke, Brian Enton from News Nation was first to post about it on X. And I started to get text messages, a crazy number of them. Are you hearing this? What are you, trying to verify with me? And we were going to do our best, but I also happened to be in Denver. So a little bit of a full circle in some regards, but you don't have time to think about anything else at that point. It's just, what can we verify? Who can we call? And that was exactly what I did. I hopped on the phone with my editor and I said, hey, here's what I'm hearing. We got to jump on this immediately. It's obviously of national interest and scope. And, with partnering with Alex on that, we raced as fast as we could to verify it. Alex was able to get a hold of one of the family members and it was off to the races. And we weren't first, but we were absolutely certain that we had it once we did, and we got it out as quickly as we could. And, I guess that set the course for the rest of how we got here today, including sentencing.
For all of you, I had this question written down in advance, and actually one of our readers asked pretty much the same question. What was the moment since November of 2022 that really stands out to you? A key piece of information, an event, a wild rumor we had to rebut. What's as you guys think back on this, what's going to be the thing that sticks in your head? And we'll start with Sally.
The thing that immediately came to mind is, of course, when they announced Bryan Kohberger as the suspect. And why it stands out to me was it was in December, late December, and I was actually home with my family in Minnesota at the time. And when this press conference was announced, I immediately pull it up on my laptop, and my whole extended family is all gathered around watching it with me. It was just one of those moments as a reporter that just stands out to you. And I definitely won't forget that press conference.
Angela?
Yeah, I was struggling to think of a specific moment because being up there in the weeks after it happened was such a whirlwind, and I feel like there were a lot of moments that could kind of fit that bill. I think one of them was we talk about the high level of like media attention and scrutiny and just people who are wanting more information about this case, and there were all of these forums and Facebook groups created online where people could kind of discuss the latest details and share information. And I think maybe, I had been tweeting a lot about the coverage and sharing everything that we knew. And people were posting, there was this subreddit that was created, r/Moscow murders. And my boyfriend told me, during the course of us being up there and me covering the case, that someone said I look like Harry Potter, and it had hundreds of upvotes. And there were just some funny moments like that where you realize that you're not just a person who lived in this community for a while, but you're also someone covering it, and people are following that coverage. And so there was a really just interesting and sometimes weird and funny dynamic there, I guess.
Alex?
I think, it's weird being even on this panel with Angela, I think in some ways, because we actually, went to school together and worked at the student newspaper together. And I think it's just weird. I used to say that I didn't grow up in Idaho, but I obviously went to school here and my family's from here. And, I used to tell people where I went to school. The joke was that I went to school in Moscow, not Moscow. And that was kind of the thing. And now, I can't mention where I went to school without this coming up. And this kind of set the tone of what people know about Moscow and the community, if they're not from here. And I think that's hard when you think of Moscow. I don't think of that. I think of, my friends and the campus and the hills and all the bars we went to and all those, the really fun moments. But I think, just kind of the place that you grew to love so much becoming such a national spectacle has been hard, and it's weird to see. And I'm glad to now see that, the community can focus on healing and kind of putting this hopefully behind them as much as they can. But I think it's just really, I think to me that just the overall national spectacle and the way that this has kind of highlighted such a, I think, quaint, beautiful place that so many of us loved going to school at, has just been kind of a weird moment of the case. And kind of when I mention to people, covering it, that, we went to school there or that kind of stuff, it's just kind of this weird side thing that happens while doing the normal part of my job. But yeah.
Kevin?
I'll piggyback off of some of that. Idaho remains a fairly small community as a state, about 2 million people, and Moscow is about 25,000, and that's give or take as the college community comes and goes for the academic calendar year. And I think the county is about 40,000, which I know we always say it's small and rural and all of that, but for a city and a county in Idaho, it's actually not that small. But something that sticks out for me, and I'll never really forget it, was when I traveled to Pennsylvania, and I was in Monroe County where Bryan Kohberger grew up. And kind of an old adage of journalism is if you're traveling, you should stop at the local bar. And so I did. I pulled up a seat, and I saw as happy hour started, and all of the blue collar workers from that community, school bus drivers and retired military, and all these people showed up to see friends, on their daily routine probably. And I'll never forget, because I was somebody from outside, and I was speaking with this military vet. He pulled up to the corner of the bar, and he said, "Who are you?" And not in an unfriendly way, but he just had never seen me, and this was not a place used to newcomers. And I said, "Oh, I'm actually traveling from Idaho." And granted, a lot of people don't meet a lot of people from Idaho, but I had mentioned this, and he looked at me. He said, "Not from Moscow, I hope." And it hit for me that. While we were kind of insular and understanding the scope of this case, and Angela mentioned at those early press conferences, there were big name national media folk who were traveling to this, dot on a map, essentially. It drew the spotlight. And as Alex had just mentioned, I mean, Moscow, Idaho will unfortunately be tied to this crime forever. And there is healing that is taking place, but there's no way to remove this from the history. And the fact that some gentleman in Effort, Pennsylvania, was very familiar with Moscow, Idaho, even pronounced it properly. It drove home for me, and it said a lot.
Since the plea deal, we've had access to records and interviews that were off limits before. Kevin and Alex, you guys have done the most of that work. What's the nugget that's been the most interesting to you that's come out since those records and interviews have been possible? We'll start with Alex.
I think we're obviously still kind of going through them. It's especially the records that have come through. There's just been, it's like 300 documents, but they're each their own length of page. So probably looking at close to 1,000 pages of records. I think, to me, I think knowing this level of detail has been, it's been really interesting to see, and kind of starting to connect the dots. I think, the thing that I think, it's kind of made the news obviously already, and has been, I guess, the most sensational, or the thing that, everyone's had interest in, but to me stuck out was just unfortunately how brutal the crimes were. I think no one expected a stabbing death to be not brutal or heinous, but actually having to read through some of that and seeing that the level of brutality that the 4 students and how they were killed was just, I think, it was really hard to read, and it was quite shocking to me that I think that those details never fully made their way out. We'd heard maybe rumors or things, but nothing that really seemed like no true confirmation. Other than a couple things here and there. We started hearing things from families, but that was more recently. And so I think, just kind of hearing that and having to read through that, and I think it's just really unfortunate. And you never expected it to be a good thing, obviously, but it's one of the harder things I've had to write about, and I don't write about very happy things. So.
Kevin.
Yeah, I agree with Alex. The total showstopper of them all thus far is unfortunately the level of damage during this attack. And Kaylee Consalvis's parents held a press conference immediately following the sentencing hearing and divulged that their daughter had been stabbed dozens of times. And I think, and in fact, Xana Kernodle was even worse. And I think it changes your perspective on the crime. Again, as Alex said, I mean, we know it was just so brutal, and police officers were having a difficult time as they arrived, including a rookie cop was the first to arrive up in Moscow. But once you know that level of brutality and what Bryan Kohberger did, it's hard to look at him in any sort of way that's human. The other document that I think is particularly interesting is the thus far, based on our read, but it's the 2 lead investigators out of Idaho traveled for Kohberger's arrest in Pennsylvania, and they had some initial interview with him before they started to talk about the homicides, and then he asked for an attorney, and that kind of ended it. But it's a really interesting document to see that he was talking very casually, and Corporal Brett Payne out of Moscow PD actually talked about this at the question and answer session during the press conference about Kohberger's demeanor was just calm when they were interviewing him. And you got to remember, Kohberger the family had just had a raid from the FBI and Pennsylvania State Police on their home. And he's just talking casually about his academic career and how he likes baseball and how he was raised Christian, but kind of a skeptic. And as he made his drive in July across the country from Pennsylvania to Pullman, his first trip to the Pacific Northwest, he just really was in awe at the beauty of the drive and the wilderness. And it made him rethink his spirituality. And you got to think, this man had killed 4 people just a month and a half earlier, and yet is having this casual conversation with police after they broke windows, knocked down the door of his parents' home. The only thing he asked about later was, how are my parents doing and my dog? But it's wild to think that was who he was, and able to just maintain this cool and calm demeanor as they asked him questions. And then as they lead up to wanting to ask him about the homicides, he, shut off to some extent. But it's hard to fathom who lives in that body and in that brain. And that document really stuck out to me.
Obviously, everybody wants to know the motive. That was, I think, the first reader question, and we may never know that. But other than that, what's the biggest question you all still have about this case? For me, and Kevin and I have kicked this around a few times, is whether Kohberger ever would have been caught if he hadn't lost the night shoot. That's the one that still sticks with me. Just the idea that he could still be out there. But for the 4 of you, what's the big question that you still have? We'll start with Sally.
For me, I would love to know, why this group of people. Police have said they've not found any connection between Kohberger and any of the victims. How did he get on the radar? Why this group? Why, was one person in particular targeted? We still have no idea about any of that.
Yeah. Angela?
Yeah, I think the murders instilled a sense of fear in the community that just wasn't there before. And obviously some of that has dissipated. But like Kevin mentioned earlier, Moscow is now a place that is always going to be known as a place where this happened. And so I think my biggest question is just how the community continues to heal from this in the years to come. I did some reporting when I was up in Moscow in the days after this happened about how residents and students were kind of boosting their personal security, locking their doors. Like Moscow was not a place where people would lock their doors. People were locking their doors after this happened, and they were going out. And I talked to students and other residents who were going out and getting guns, getting pepper spray, like something that they could kind of, that would just boost their personal security. And I know there's been a lot of healing, and, the community has really come together after this happened. And now that Kohberger has been sentenced, there's a lot of closure from that. But yeah, I think my biggest question is just how this continues to kind of leave its mark on Moscow in the years to come.
Alex?
I think, again, there's so many unanswered questions in some ways, and I think the why, but to me, it's, that I guess what went wrong. We've never found anything that indicated that Kohberger's family, or that he had, he had, some troubles in his life with addiction and that kind of stuff, but that does not make someone go out and kill 4 people. Lots of people deal with struggles and mental illness and other kinds of things. And, that's just not, they don't do the kinds of things that he's done. And I think, it's to try to understand, I don't know that we'd ever understand that, but it, try to figure out what caused a person to want to do this. Because I think, it's one of those things where you try to understand why, Ted Bundy did the things he did, or that kind of thing. It's is there a way that we can learn about this, that maybe there's better things we can do for people at a younger age so that these kinds of things don't happen? I don't know if that's possible, and that's a big task, but it would be really great to have some kind of understanding of what could have been prevented or circumvented so that this never would have happened. I don't know if there would have been an answer, but yeah.
Kevin?
Yeah, likewise. There's so many questions that many people have, including myself, and the why and the motivation behind this is certainly at the forefront of that. But in terms of logistics related to the crime, we know that Kohberger had background and education in crime scene processing, and even that said, it's still just it boggles the mind that he was able to get out of that home without leaving a trail of blood, as an example. What was he wearing? What did he do with the clothes? Where was the knife? What happened to the murder weapon? Those types of questions. And he then cleaned the car. It was almost spotless, according to prosecutor Bill Thompson at the plea hearing. And so he had planned this from every stage. He walked out with some sort of, it's been described as like a vacuum-like container, something that the one of the two roommates had seen him exit the property with. And, he obviously left the knife sheath, which was a key factor, but in getting to him, as we've discussed. But I think knowing or learning rather how he was able to dispose of all these items, avoid any sort of detection at his apartment. There's no trace of any of the 4 victims. I have real curiosity about that, even with his level of knowledge of crime scenes and processing, and how he was able to avoid detection, because as we know, the DNA on that knife sheath was so key to this case.
Now we'll answer some reader questions. So from Julie, now that Moscow has released 300 plus records, are you surprised how little information was leaked, considering how many people, especially U of I students, had knowledge of the crime? She also thanked all of you for your great work. But Kevin, are you surprised by how much of this didn't come out?
I am. There were many close friends, including those on the 911 call, who were called over to the property to check from one of the roommates, inquiring and asking them to come help. And we didn't even so much as know their names for a long time. And I think it speaks to the level of protection and personal connection that people felt to this incident. Obviously, the 4 victims were very popular in the community, in the Greek life culture there too. And so I think this was so personal for so many people. And I will share that one of the struggles I had over the 2.5+ years of reporting on this was actually reaching a lot of those friends. We obviously know about the siblings of Ethan Chapin, for instance. They never spoke until they were part of this Amazon Prime 4-part docuseries that came out tied to the James Patterson, Vicky Ward book. And that only came out about, 2 weeks ago or so. So it's the first time we've heard from them. And many of the friends associated with them from the fraternities and the sororities, if they'd talk to you, it would be small bits and messages, and then ultimately declining interviews and things like that. And they knew some of these details, but it was whether it was the police keeping it close to the vest or asking potential witnesses not to speak, or the 2 surviving roommates, nobody spoke. And a lot of this information is still it's still trickling out, including in these records, because we've just never heard from these people. And it is a bit of a surprise because it's such a public crime and it's so much in the spotlight, and yet we still are learning so much more by the day.
From Michael, what do we know about why it took so long for police to be called to the house that day? Sally?
So Dylan Mortensen was the roommate who heard and saw Kohberger that night. And it was always a question for me, why didn't she call police right away? She still has not spoken publicly about this, but with the drop of a bunch of the newly released documents, we did get some new insights. She herself in a police interview described herself as, very in and out of it. A friend who she called the next morning said she was intoxicated, and that the friend said she was told that she didn't want to believe what was happening. And another clue, I think, from these documents was that this was a party house. This was a house that had been handed back and forth between sororities and fraternities. People were constantly going in and out of it. Someone close to them said that way more people knew the code to the door than should. I think we can get an insight that this maybe wasn't uncommon to see strange people in the house. And, we all know, how safe everyone thought Moscow was. They hadn't had a murder in 7 years. I think she was only, she just turned 18 or 19 at the time. I think we're starting to realize that she just, it was hard maybe to believe that that a quadruple homicide could possibly going on. Like, who could think of that? And we'll never know for sure, what was going through her head until she speaks herself. But those documents did include new clues.
Thanks. From Marie, what did you observe of Bryan Kohberger's mother and sister during the sentencing hearing? She says, I also feel they are deeply impacted by all this horror. Alex, you were there. What'd you see?
Yeah, I could see them actually pretty well from where I was sitting, and we saw them as well, or we saw his mother during the plea hearing as well, and his father at that time. But we saw his mother and sister, and they just looked absolutely heartbroken. It was honestly quite hard to see them like that, and I think they looked just I can't imagine what they're going through as well. And actually, one of the victim impact statements, I think from Xana's family, actually spoke a little bit about that, but. His mother was just sobbing during a lot of it, especially, hearing the impact statements from Xana and Maddie and Ethan and Kaylee's parents, or Ethan's family wasn't there, but, just hearing about from the family, and his sister, she pretty much had tears kind of bubbling in her eyes kind of the whole time, and just looked, kind of stricken. And I think it was just really, obviously it was very hard for them to hear all this and probably to comprehend the person they knew with what they're hearing. So yeah, they just looked absolutely heartbroken.
From Vieira, what do we know about a possible second weapon, Kevin?
I spoke with Prosecutor Bill Thompson just yesterday, and I asked him this question. ABC News was reporting that there was a horizontal pattern on Kaylee Gonsalves, and they're not real clear on what that might have been. Her older sister, during the sentencing hearing, brought this up. It was the first we've ever heard of it, and confronted Kohberger directly during her victim impact statement, asking about what was the second weapon, Bryan. And so we don't know what that is. Bill Thompson, Chief Fry, when I spoke to him, they're just not real clear on what that is, nor what he may have carried out with two hands. Kind of a container motion is what reportedly Dylan had shown that to police officers as she explained what she witnessed from the home. So it's not clear. Thompson told me yesterday that whatever it was didn't break the skin. And again, it's some sort of horizontal pattern. But he said the way he described it to me is, I can't exclude the fact that there may have been a second weapon. As we know, law enforcement never found the knife itself. So we're not real clear on what it was. It's possible that there was some sort of alternate weapon, as Thompson described it to me, but it's not clear, and I don't think we'll ever necessarily know.
From Kimber, will we ever find out more details about the items discovered during the search of Kohberger's family home? IDs found in a glove box, something about a Glock. I don't want to read this exactly because I don't want to read details that we might not want to read out, but along those lines, Kevin.
So the Glock was actually found at his parents' Pennsylvania home, and that was obtained through the search warrant. So I'm not sure there's much more to say about that. Part of the search warrant was for all knives, and so they had some pocket knives and some things like that. And I believe there was more than one firearm. So the Glock is one of those. I don't think it's relevant. This wasn't a gun crime, as we know. A lot of questions about the book with the underlining on page 118. When I spoke with Thompson yesterday, he told me, he acknowledged he actually doesn't know the details of that. They did acquire a bunch of the academic books that Kohberger would have been studying for his forensic psychology and criminal justice and criminology background and education. He was not sure exactly what book that was. I'm following up on that with the investigators, so stay tuned there. But Thompson was not as familiar with that. This is a really interesting detail that I'll share here. The two IDs, we had long heard rumor that they were of two women, and there were some rumors that were wrong. It's definitely false information that they were identification cards for any of the victims. So that's absolutely wrong if you've heard or read that. What they are, however, Thompson confirmed they were of two women. And one, he said, was actually one of his coworkers from when he worked at the Pleasant Valley School District in Pennsylvania as a part-time security guard. So one of them is actually a female security guard who he worked with. What Thompson told me, and they were in contact with these two women. I don't know who the second one was, but he said that the two women were very surprised and not clear how Kohberger had obtained their IDs. So that's not clear, but that's what those were. So that's new information I think we're putting out into the world right now.
From Amanda, it was difficult to see Kohberger's facial expressions clearly in the sentencing with the video quality. Can you give us a better sense of what you saw from him in person, Alex?
Yeah, well, it's probably because there wasn't much facial expression. In all honesty, he didn't really have much of a reaction. Even when the Gonzalez family, like Steve, actually, when he came up and gave his statement, he actually turned the podium toward him and faced him head on, and that whole family spoke to him that way. And I was actually kind of looking down at my computer typing, and I heard kind of a noise and looked back up and realized that's what had happened. I wasn't looking right at Kohberger as that happened, but I didn't see really a large reaction from him in any way. I mean, he really had absolutely no reaction on his face pretty much throughout the whole sentencing. On it, maybe during one of, I think, from Kaylee's sister, there might have been a small, like, kind of tremor or something in his jaw, that his jaw might have ticked slightly during some of her comments towards him, which were pretty direct. But really quite, I would say he looked quite disassociated and kind of just very blank, just kind of stared head on. There really wasn't much to see.
From Angela, now that the gag order has been lifted, have you attempted to interview the defense team? And Kevin, I know you have, so I'll let you take that.
I wrote 3 profiles for some of the key players in the case. The first was Bill Thompson, the prosecutor. The second was defense attorney Ann Taylor. And the third was Judge Stephen Hippler. And in the midst of reporting those stories out, I reached out to Ann Taylor directly, who has now transitioned out of being a state employee as a public defender and back into private practice, but was continuing on with this case, obviously. And so when I sent her an email requesting comment as part of that profile that I wrote about her, I did hear back from the law firm, and I don't think they circulated that to a lot of news outlets, but I think they were kind of getting back to a prior request, which is what I had filed. And they said that they wouldn't speak before sentencing, which comported with what the prosecution also intended to do. And then even with the gag order drop, they said they will not be speaking afterwards, and that's because they need to abide by ethical rules with regards to representation of a client. And so legally speaking, I was going to say technically speaking, but I think that's true too, they actually cannot speak to the media about this case without Kohberger's permission, and whether or not they will seek that, we're not clear. But as it stands, the 3 attorneys and 4th attorney, including the public defender up north, Jay Logston, who was on the case for years, we have not heard from them, and the intent is expected that they will not be speaking about this case going forward.
Along those lines, Melanie had 2 questions. One of them sort of along those lines. And I'm not sure, Kevin or Alex, which one of you is better to take this, but are there any signs that the Kohberger family wants to talk at all?
I'll let Kevin take that one.
Sure. They also they issued an initial statement, if people think back, about how heartbroken they were, and they supported their son and brother, and that was a statement through the public defender in Pennsylvania at the time. So that was almost immediately following the arrest, and they asked for peace and privacy, basically, as they struggled through this time as well. And more recently, they also have declined to comment. And as we led into the plea hearing and then also sentencing, where we saw various family members attend, they just issued a very similar statement that they were seeking privacy as essentially they go through their own grieving process. But so far, we have not seen anything from his family of any real substance, basically declining to answer questions or take interviews. And it's anyone's guess at this point. Perhaps they will surface and choose to speak about Kohberger at some point, but I'm not personally anticipating it.
Melanie's other question, I'm going to go to Angela, is how cooperative was the police in connection with the reporting? And obviously for a lot of this period, they were under a gag order and they couldn't cooperate with us at all. But the early days, they could. So Angela, what was your experience there?
My experience was interesting because, like I mentioned earlier, I had worked for the Moscow Pullman Daily News before joining the newsroom here at the Statesman. And so I had already met the prosecutor, Bill Thompson, the police chief, James Fry, the mayor had done interviews with him. And so I kind of went up there under the impression that, this is a community that up until, 3 months prior, I'd been covering and living in. And so I kind of assumed that, these are people that would be accessible, that I could reach out to and get answers to questions. And because the scrutiny just across the board was so intense, all of this media attention they were getting, inquiries from and questions, that it wasn't like that at all. Like, it kind of wasn't what I expected it would be. There were little tidbits that would come out, and the county coroner was doing some interviews, most of them with national reporters from bigger outlets across the country, and it was kind of a difficult time to get information. There wasn't a gag order, but they wouldn't really give us answers to the questions that we had. There were little details that came out. There was some information that I emailed the Idaho State Police about where one of the surviving roommates was in the house when it happened, and they gave us an answer that later turned out not to be correct. And so there was a lot of just a lot of confusion, and there was like a little bit of information that we could get, but not really the answers to the big questions that we had.
Yeah, I know that was a frustration for me. A few of the times where we could not get, or we got information that turned out not to be true, like you're speaking of there. The other one I know I harped on a lot with our staff was that they never updated the years of the car. That, up to, I think, the day before the arrest, they were still putting out information about the car that had the wrong years in it, which I think Kevin has addressed that with them in the last few days, right, Kevin?
Yeah, I spoke with James Fry and referenced that. And granted, he was not, although he supervised the investigation, he was not one of the lead investigators. And so he's now, he retired from the force and now has resurfaced with Tri-Cities Police Department as their chief up in Washington. But he actually didn't quite recollect that. And I reminded him, I said, "You never corrected that." And he said, "Oh, I thought we did." I said, "No, you absolutely did not." And then suddenly he was arrested, and we had to understand how a 2015 Elantra was the car in question rather than one from 2011 to 2013.
The most popular question we got was various versions of things about Papa Roger. So, Kevin, I think you said you can take that question, but what have we learned at this point about the whole Papa? And for folks who don't know, maybe give a little background on what that is.
Right. So many of the viewers today are probably familiar with the large Facebook case group that developed, and I think it had 250,000 or more people following it, which just shows you the scope and interest in this case. And there was an account that developed, and it's called Papa Roger. It now no longer exists, but it was somebody in the early days who was probing and asking sort of interesting and oddly worded questions about the case and suggesting, who thinks the murderer did this or that, and one of the key elements was, they must have found a knife sheath. And that was well before we knew anything about that. That didn't even come out to the probable cause affidavit, which I believe was released publicly on January 4th, which is when Kohberger made his first public appearance in court in Idaho. And that was per Idaho rules. And so this person seemed to know a lot more than they should. And some of these things proved to be true. But a question was posed at the Q&A after the press conference following the sentencing hearing. And Lieutenant Darren Gilbertson with the Idaho State Police addressed that question directly and said, Bryan Kohberger was not Papa Roger. They scoured that information and looked at the data, and they confirmed that there's no way it was him. What was also really interesting, of course, after the fact is that Kohberger looked very similar to the Facebook photo that account used, and that account also disappeared either just in the days before or immediately following Kohberger's arrest. So there's a lot of conspiracy and questions about it, but they try to nip that in the bud during essentially the press conference and say, we looked at it and it definitely was not him.
From Christina, I know you've asked about this, Kevin. So was the prosecution prepared to call the Kohberger family to testify? And any idea what might have been the goal there if they had?
Yeah, they went back and forth with this with Judge Stephen Hippler, and it was over the question. His defense team, Kohberger's, wanted his family to be there for the duration of trial, which Hippler did ultimately grant. And as we know, usually if you're going to be called to the stand, you can't then attend trial until after that point. So that was sort of I guess that's a win of sorts for the defense as we went through the pretrial process. But in speaking with Bill Thompson yesterday, he revealed to me that the Kohberger members of the family he intended to call were his sister Amanda, who attended the sentencing hearing, Both sisters are older than Kohberger, but that was the one he intended to call. And then either his mother or father. So not both, but one or the other plus that sister. And then Thompson told me, in the end, we were just going to be using them for confirming details and things that we could prove other ways. So they, by the end, did not intend to call any of the Kohbergers to the stand for the trial.
And then Laura asked, Alex, do any of us plan to pursue an interview with Bryan Kohberger? And obviously, you have some experience dealing with how that might go with somebody who's in prison. But what would that look like? And is that something? I could answer the question, but is that something we would pursue?
Yeah, it would be. I think it's kind of, I think it's a tricky thing where obviously we try to talk to anyone and everyone involved in a case. I talk to people in prison all the time for stories I write, more prison-focused stories about, their housing conditions and kind of issues within prison or that kind of experience. But I've also talked to defendants, after sentencing, and that kind of stuff. And I would do it with anybody. But I do think we also, we're not looking to try to just, sensationalize it either. I think there's a balance of, sure, we'd talk to him, but if he'd be willing, I don't know that he would be, based on everything we've seen so far. But yeah, sure, we'd talk to him. That doesn't mean that we're going to just, if he had some spectacle to say, it doesn't mean we're going to just put that out there either. We would balance it. And I think it's also important that we are focused on doing stories more about the victims and those kind of things. So it's sure, if he'd want to talk, I'd talk to him. I'm sure Kevin would, or someone else on our staff, but it's not necessarily, I don't plan to do it in a way. I think that's try to be not overly sensational about it in the best way possible. And yeah, the way you talk to people, and anyone in prison can be reached here in Idaho. We have a messaging system called JPay. And so you just make an account and you have to pay to have stamps. They're called stamps. It's pretty much like a letter system. It's how they kind of refer to it as. And you buy a certain amount of stamps and you send someone a message, and you can send them back a stamp so they can respond back to you. And it's kind of it's pretty much like email, but you pay for it. You can also call people in prison. They have to call you. There is ways to think for you to call them, but it's kind of a bit of a more tricky process. So typically when I talk to people in prison, they just call me. And you can technically do in-person interviews. It's pretty uncommon for the Department of Correction to coordinate. They're not willing to coordinate in-person interviews with somebody that has victims. So maybe if someone is in for a more minor crime, I've done prison tours and talk to people in prison, but they're not typically in for more violent crimes. And the other thing to remember is that anything that, through messaging or for a phone call, all of those communications are recorded. So anything that, if he was willing to talk to us, that would all be monitored by the Department of Correction. So yeah, we would talk to him, but again, I think we would try to do it with the way we've done all our other reporting. So.
Cool. Well, that is our hour, and that was the last question that I had gathered as well. So. Thank you to all the readers who joined us today, and particularly thank you to Kevin, Alex, Sally, Angela, and many more on our staff for all their hard work the last almost 3 years. Careful reporting, compassion since the murders happened. And stay tuned for more reporting as details continue to emerge. Kevin and Alex are still, and I think Sally as well, still digging into some things and have stories coming. So there will be more to come on this in the coming days, and probably for some weeks. So thank you, everybody, and appreciate your time.